Chris.
Thanks, Mario. And welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to this varied group of people about leadership and more specifically about authentic leadership. I want to start, before we even jump into the agenda for today, I want to start by encouraging you to chat with me throughout the session. The chat window, and I know we're going to use the Q&A for questions, but the chat window is also available in that same toolbar that's at the top of your screen, and it gives you an opportunity to participate in today's event. Since we can't all be sitting together in a room and talking through some of these ideas of leadership, I'd like to use that chat function to see if we can't replicate some of those same interactions. We do have a varied group of people. We have people who are within their professional careers in mid or late career. We have some early career folks, and we have some students joining us today. So I think there's a lot of information that we can share and learn from each other throughout the session today. So I do want to encourage you to use that chat function. Our agenda for today is to talk about authentic leadership, and I'm going to start by talking about who I am and why you should listen to anything that I have to say about the topic of leadership. And then we're going to talk about what is authentic leadership. I have identified 4 characteristics of authentic leaders that I want to talk to you about and get your opinions on. So this is where that chat comes into play. I want to get your sense of whether or not you would agree with some of those characteristics of authentic leaders. And then I want to share a couple of tools of authentic leadership that have been helpful in my career, and hopefully, again, get some tools from all of you and some ideas on what has worked for you in leadership. And then, of course, we're going to do that Q&A at the end of the session. So do please feel free. I encourage you to ask some questions. This is me, Chris Burd, and in the interest of authenticity, I thought that I would share this photo of myself, which is perhaps a little bit more real, a little bit more authentic of an image of who I am and my leadership and the team that I participate in. As Mario mentioned, I'm a 1998 graduate of Pitt's College of Business Administration, which puts me in that first graduating class. There was about 25 of us, I think, in that first graduating class in December of '98. And it also puts me in the first freshman class that started now 20 years ago this fall, in 1995, at the University of Pittsburgh's College of Business Administration. That photo happens to be a photo of myself and my 2 grandmothers at my college graduation. While at the CBA at Pitt, I majored in finance. I got a certificate in Russian and Eastern European Studies. I studied Russian language and Russian literature. And I also had the opportunity to be a financial engineering intern at an organization or company in Pittsburgh that worked in weather derivatives. I also had the opportunity to study abroad at in St. Petersburg, Russia, and I was the president of the Business Student Council in its 2nd year of existence at the University of Pittsburgh's College of Business Administration. The reason that I called out those specific aspects of my college experience is that it really plays into the current tagline for Pitt Business and the CBA. I had the opportunity to have experiences while at the University of Pittsburgh in the classroom, in the city, and in the world. I had the opportunity to take those classroom learnings, apply them to internships within the city of Pittsburgh, and to make that a global experience by studying Russian business in St. Petersburg, Russia. And so for those of you that are on the line that may still be students at the University of Pittsburgh, I can't stress enough the combination of those experiences and the advantage of having that opportunity to make that mix of experiences. After graduating from Pitt, I started my career at Deloitte Consulting. I took my finance degree and I promptly went into the IT arena, and I've been there ever since. I was a systems implementation consultant with Deloitte and ultimately became an application manager of the project that I was working on at Deloitte Consulting. When I left Deloitte, I moved on to a small e-commerce company that was based, North American operations were based in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. It was a German-based company, and it was ultimately acquired by much larger Digital River, which is based out of Minnesota. I became the North American operations manager of that Element 5 division at Digital River. Now, the last 10 years I've been with Resources Global Professionals, and I've been with the PolicyIQ division of RGP. I am currently the Managing Director of the PolicyIQ division, and PolicyIQ is RGP's governance, risk, and compliance software application. So my role is to manage and lead the team that both develops and supports the PolicyIQ application. I talk about all of those different roles to talk about my experiences with leadership and coming out of the University of Pittsburgh, the roles that have put me in a place of leadership and have required those leadership skills. We are here today to talk about leadership, and it's interesting that this was my chosen topic for this presentation because right around the time that I was talking to Jessica Stillman, who, if you're not familiar with Jessica, she is the Director of Constituent Relations at the College of Business Administration. And I was talking to Jessica about potentially participating in this webinar session, and at that time, I was actually struggling with leadership. I was having a bit of a crisis of faith in my own leadership capabilities. And so I was seeking out information, seeking out feedback and new ideas about how I could improve myself as a leader. I went to some of my most trusted professional mentors, some of my most trusted friends, and even family members, and I asked about ways that I could improve my own leadership capabilities. And there were two recurring themes that came up. And I want to talk about those, and those actually led to then this presentation and this idea. The first theme that kept coming up for me was that all leaders ultimately question their leadership skills from time to time. All of us who have some level of leadership responsibility have those moments where we question our own leadership skills. And I would say that any leader who tells you that they don't question their own leadership skills is either hiding the truth or they're maybe not as self-aware as they could be. The second thing that kept coming up over and over again is that the most important thing that a leader can do is to be honest and to be genuine. And that's really where this particular presentation came from, is that idea that we're not just talking about leadership, but we're actually talking about something that's a little bit beyond leadership and talking about authentic leadership. Now, if you've sat in any leadership sessions, any leadership training, probably one of the first lessons that you learn is that leadership does not equal management. These are two very different things. What I want to stress is that sometimes I think the idea of management and management skills get a bad rap. We talk about leaders, and sometimes we dismiss what management really is. And they're very different, but that doesn't mean that one's less important than the other. Management is about allocating resources to make sure that something gets completed, so whether it's a task or a project. Management is the skill set that's necessary to make sure that the resources are applied properly and ultimately, hopefully, efficiently to get a task completed. That's a really critical set of skills that every organization needs. And so great managers are certainly something that we want to foster and build. Leadership is a little bit different, though, and leadership skills are sometimes a little bit more difficult to talk about because leadership is not necessarily about the resources and the allocation of resources. Leadership is about inspiring people to accomplish a goal. Now, that's my definition of leadership, and that's my simplified, oversimplified definition of leadership. Again, I'd actually ask if you're willing to participate in that chat function, if you want to just take a moment and share if there's a different definition of leadership or if there's more that you think you would add to that definition of leadership. What is leadership? What is the definition of that? Now, when I talked to my manager and my boss, the CIO of RGP, Brandon Johnson, when I talked to him and asked him about his definition of leadership, Brandon actually was a little bit more specific. And Brandon said leadership is about inspiring people to accomplish a goal that they would not otherwise be able to accomplish. And I thought that was really interesting because for him, the definition of leadership really talks about the value of leadership, which is you're inspiring people to accomplish something that they might not otherwise be able to accomplish or that they don't think they're able to accomplish. Dennis, I think I really appreciate, Dennis had added to the chat that leadership is about influence. I think that's absolutely true. Leadership is about influence, and good leadership is about how we use that influence. Leadership being about the environment to help people reach their personal best. I love that. That's about empowerment and empowering people. And I also think that's really a great definition of leadership. So please feel free to continue to share those on the chat function. I also want to stress, again, because we do have a mixed audience, I want to stress that leaders do not necessarily sit in these formal business positions. Leaders are not necessarily formally managers. They don't necessarily have a title that forces them into a leadership role. I happen to be in a formal position where leadership is, frankly, a requirement of my role. As the managing director of a team, my job requires me to also be a leader. But that's not always the case. There are a lot of situations where leaders, and the best leaders, come from within the ranks of a team. Leaders can be students, they can be professionals, they can be part of community organizations. These are not always part of a company. These are throughout, of course, our lives. We have different leaders doing different things. If you are a parent, by the nature of being a parent, you are a leader. You are inspiring those little people to do things that they might not think they could otherwise accomplish. So leadership is really important in all aspects of our lives. So we're talking about leadership, but what is authentic leadership? And why is authentic leadership different? Why do I stress authentic leadership over simply leadership? What is that all about? I do want to give credit where credit is due. Bill George in 2004 released a book called Authentic Leadership, and that was really the trigger for this formal school of thought around authentic leadership. And so this was really where that started. He certainly didn't invent the phrase, but he promoted and he started a revolution, or he started a theory, I suppose I should say, about authentic leadership. And he really pointed out two different things. He pointed out that authentic leadership is about having honest relationships with your team members, and he pointed out that authentic leadership requires that it is built on an ethical foundation. So those two things are things that he pointed out as really characteristics of authentic leadership. I think the question still remains, though, which is, why do we strive for authentic leadership? Why should we want to be authentic leaders? What makes it important? And we can look at this from two different perspectives. In order to be an effective leader, we know that it is important for the people that we are leading to trust us. And in order to build trust, we do need to be authentic and honest, and we need to have those genuine relationships. And frankly, those need to be built on an ethical framework. And so I think in order to be a great leader, in my opinion, you also need to be an authentic leader. On the other side of that, I would argue that authentic leadership is also a way to save our sanity as leaders. There's a phrase out there that it's lonely at the top, and I will tell you that I dislike that phrase a lot. I understand where it comes from. There are origins in this idea that as a leader, maybe more so as a manager, there is a need for discretion, there's a need for confidentiality, and it creates sometimes an atmosphere that it feels lonely to be the leader. But I think authentic leadership gives us a different way to look at that. There is still a need for discretion, there's still a need for confidentiality, there is still some critical things as a leader that we need to deal with from ourselves or from our leaders and our managers. But creating genuine relationships with our team members means it doesn't have to be so lonely as a leader. I also want to point out here that I think that one of the things that authentic leadership encourages is the creation of and the promotion of additional leaders, that you don't have to lead alone. And so I think those are the two things within that I would point out there as authentic leadership. So with all of that said, again, in creating this presentation, I thought, okay, so what really makes an authentic leader? And there's a lot of scholarship out there about authentic leadership, so there's a lot of places that you can look. I chose to ask the people around me. So I wanted to ask folks, what do they think of when they think of authentic leadership? And I created this really long list. And I'm actually going to, again, ask you guys, if you have some thoughts, put them in chat. What do you think creates authentic leadership? Are there things that you're thinking about? And then I'll tell you what mine are, of course, in the course of the presentation. So I created this really long list of things that I thought made a leader an authentic leader. And they were different skills, they were different qualities, different traits, characteristics, all of these different things that made someone an authentic leader. And I started to create a presentation so that I could highlight as many of those as possible. And after creating a PowerPoint presentation that would have taken me about 3 hours to get through, I thought maybe I ought to scale it back. Maybe I ought to do something a little bit different. And so what I did is I started classifying those. What are the big categories of traits that make a great authentic leader? This is what I came up with. And again, I'm going to encourage you to give me some feedback on these. Do you agree? Do you not agree? Do you have something else you want to talk through? Number one is honesty, humility, self-awareness, and vulnerability. Those were the 4 characteristics of authentic leaders where all of the different traits and attributes I thought fell into those 4 different areas. Now, those 4 different traits are making you a little bit queasy. I'm going to ask you to stick with me, and I'm going to explain what I mean by those because they are all a little bit soft. These aren't things that you can write down, this is what makes me a humble, authentic leader, but we're going to talk through some examples. I want to start with honesty, and I'm starting with honesty, number one, because I think it's the most obvious trait. I think in order to be authentic, or I should say really authenticity is honesty, so I think that's obvious. But this is also the trait that inspired my subtitle, Why Being Yourself is More Important Than Being the Boss. When I talk about being yourself, I don't necessarily mean that you need to bring in your Hello Kitty collection and decorate your desk at work, or that everyone needs to know all of the details about your family life. And while it works for me, I also don't necessarily mean that you should feel comfortable dressing up as Wonder Woman for Halloween. In fact, for some of you, I suspect that's probably wildly inappropriate. But what I do mean is that you need to be leading your team without a mask. You need to lead as your own human self and not as a caricature of the leader that you think you should be. So you're approaching your leadership from your own honest base. Authentic leadership requires that leaders are also honest and transparent in both good times and bad. And I'm going to tell you that this is probably the leadership trait that I struggle personally with the most. It's really easy to be authentic. It's really easy to be honest. It's really easy to be yourself when things are good, but it's much more difficult to do when things are bad. Because as leaders, we know that we need to balance the need to project positivity and optimism. We're leading people, we're inspiring people. We need to be optimistic and positive about the future of our project or our team. And in times of difficulty, that can be difficult to balance with some bad news that might be coming through. So we need to be the type of leader that can talk about the negative, but turn it around and make sure that we understand that with every failure, with everything that's not going right, there's a lesson to be learned and something coming forward in the future. That's one thing that I think is probably one of the hardest traits of leaders. I actually want to stop here, though, and I want to tell a personal story because the honesty trait is one that really speaks to me and speaks to a story that I have of a professional mentor that is one of my most significant role models as a leader. To set the scene, I need to tell you a little bit about the situation that I was in at the time that this happened. I was working at Element 5, which was a company that, as I mentioned, the North American operations were based in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And we had just been acquired by Digital River, which was out of Minnesota. I had just moved to Minnesota as the only employee of Element 5 in the United States who was staying with the team after the acquisition. And so I was tasked, my task was to reestablish the operations at the Digital River facility in Minneapolis. I had to hire an entire team to manage the call center. I had to merge computer systems. As a team, we had to do this. And then we had to train everybody and do it in a short period of time. My direct manager was sitting in Germany at our Element 5 main office. And so I'm in this position where there's a lot of things going on, there's a lot of stress. If you've ever participated in a merger or acquisition, it is one of the most stressful both management and leadership challenges that you can experience. And I was doing it after having moved away from my family, away from my home, and into a city that I had never previously even visited before. So this was a really difficult situation. That's the setup for this. And one morning in the middle of a week that, frankly, there was nothing going right, absolutely nothing was going well, I got a call from my manager, from my boss. Now, if you've ever gotten a call from your boss in the middle of a week that has nothing going well for you, you probably understand the feeling that was in the pit of my stomach. You put up walls, you put on your game face, and you brace yourself for whatever it is that's coming next. So when I picked up the phone and Ralph, who was my manager at the time, he asked, "How are you?" I responded very tersely with, "Fine, how are you?" That's just my response. "Fine, how are you?" And I should have known that it was a little different because Ralph's not big on small talk. So he replied to that and he said, "No, really, how are you?" And I understood that he was asking a question that was more than just a greeting. The conversation that Ralph and I had at that point sticks with me because it is, I think, one of the most powerful moments of great leadership, honest leadership, and leadership in one of the most difficult situations. In the midst of this really terrible week, he didn't ask about call statistics. He didn't ask about wait times in the call center. He didn't ask about email stats. Ralph asked me how I was sleeping. He asked me when was the last time I left the office to go to lunch. He wanted to know if I had settled everything with my apartment, if I was actually getting a chance to go out and see the city. He essentially was just checking in to make sure that I was taking care of myself. Ralph was a really private person. He didn't talk about his family that much. But in that moment, he was being really honest and being very genuine and making sure that I was okay. Now, we did end the conversation talking about email stats, so we got through that, and then we certainly got into some of the meat of what was happening. We talked about how the team was performing. We talked about the fact that we had just lost a team member we had to replace, we had to rehire. And Ralph quoted Winston Churchill. And his quote to me as we wrapped up the conversation was, "When you're going through hell, keep going." Now, I don't know if you've ever had someone quote Winston Churchill at you in a professional situation, but I will tell you that normally that would be cause for alarm. But at that moment, that's what I needed to hear. I needed to know from him that things were terrible. He recognized that things were terrible. He recognized that we were, in fact, going through hell, but that we needed to keep going and that there was something coming that was better at the end of it. I hung up the phone, and I will tell you that nothing changed in that particular week. We still had terrible stats. We had 30-minute call time waits, and if you've ever waited for a customer service representative for 30 minutes, you know that by the time you get to that representative, they are not happy, or that I should say that you are not happy. Nothing had changed in the situation, but my perspective had changed. I was inspired to accomplish something that I previously didn't think I could accomplish. And honestly, in that moment, it was just surviving that week. It was getting through that week unscathed. And that, to me, is my most powerful moment of honest, genuine leadership and authentic leadership. And I promise that's the longest story that I'll tell in this particular presentation. I do, again, want to encourage, if you have some examples, I appreciate everyone who's providing examples. Alan actually had mentioned that, people feel the need to always be a cheerleader, but sometimes you just have to share bad news, and you have to just be direct about it. Sometimes it's not positive. Sometimes something terrible happens. The positive thing that you can say is, it's over and we're moving on. Sometimes that's really the best that you can do, and I think that that is true, authentic leadership. Of course, that leads to our second characteristic, and that is humility. Sometimes in those situations where we're sharing bad news, we do have to come at it with some level of humility. Sometimes it's a decision that we made as a leader that didn't pan out. And so we need to come and say, you know what, this was a mistake, or it didn't go our way, and so we need to regroup and try again. The thing that I want to point out about humility is that I think that a lot of us struggle with humility because in a lot of ways we're taught that we have to be the person with all the answers. And I would encourage you to push back against that. You don't have to be the person with all the answers. None of us do. We're all human. We all have our strengths and our weaknesses. Every one of us needs to seek feedback. And I think, sort of mentioning that first origin of this presentation where I was seeking feedback on my own leadership skills, that was one of the first things that's really, you know, that humility to say, okay, something's wrong in the way that I'm leading, and I need to pull back and see what feedback I can get. And that doesn't necessarily always mean feedback on your leadership skills. You need to seek feedback on all of the things that you're doing. The other thing that I stress, and this is really important to me, is that I think everybody, including all of the leaders in an organization, need to be willing to be the student. Again, we don't have all the answers. We don't have all the skills. We can't do it alone. And so there are people on our team that are able to teach us things. Everybody on our team has something to teach us, and we all need to be willing to be the student. I think it's a sign of a great leader who's not afraid to be the student. I also think it's a sign of a great leader who's not afraid to step back and let somebody else take over the leadership when it makes sense. Great leaders create great leaders, and great leaders are not afraid of other people who can lead the team. I think a good example of this, or a good situation for this, is there are always those projects, those things that come up that we're just not that enthusiastic about. It just doesn't fit our wheelhouse. It's just not something that we're enthusiastic about. And it's hard to be a great inspirational leader if you're trying to do something that maybe you just aren't feeling. And so finding somebody else on your team who can be that leader, who can take the charge and be enthusiastic about that project, I think is a critical skill. I will tell you that I am really lucky on the team that I'm in right now to be surrounded by great leaders within the ranks of the team. And so when there are projects that just really don't fit my wheelhouse, not something that I'm completely comfortable taking the charge on, I know that there's somebody else who's going to be able to step up. The third characteristic of great leaders, and again, I'm going to encourage you, if you have any other ones that you want to add in here, any other characteristics of great leaders, put them in here. Actually, there was one that came through, I think it was from Matt, who said that great leaders are, one of the characteristics there is someone who would only ask employees to do something that they would do themselves. I think that's fantastic. I think that fits into that humility aspect a little bit as well. If you're not willing to do it yourself, you shouldn't be asking other people to do it. My third characteristic is self-awareness. And I have a story I want to share here as well, but I think self-awareness is about understanding your own reactions to events, making sure that you're playing up your strengths and mitigating your weaknesses, and doing that for everybody on your team. And you're also setting personal boundaries, lines that you know you won't cross. And I think this is also about that ethical foundation. A lot of people, I think that self-awareness is something that you either have or you don't. You're either self-aware or you're not self-aware. And I would say that that's really untrue in a really significant way. I don't know that any of us are truly just inherently self-aware, but it's something that we foster. Some of us foster it more than others. It's a behavior that can be learned, and I think there's a lot of tools out there that can help us to learn it. I'm going to talk about a couple of the tools that I've used. For one thing, there's some books, and I'm going to highlight a couple of books at the end of this session that I happen to think are great books to read. I'm a reader, so I'll share some of those with you. I have some colleagues that are not afraid to provide feedback on my behavior and tell me how I react to things, which I think is fantastic. Have to be humble in order to make that work. And I also have a fantastic therapist who provides non-judgmental perspective on the way that I experience things. And so I think those things really help my self-awareness. I want to actually bring out a story, and I think Stephanie Beerley is my colleague here on the team. I think she's actually sitting in on this session, and I'm going to kind of call her out a little bit in this particular story. Because it really is about understanding your own reactions and playing up strengths and weaknesses. Stephanie and I have worked together now for just over 10 years, and we complement each other very well. We have skill sets that really do complement each other. But there's a few things that have caused friction between us over the years. And the one that just stands out in my mind as I was thinking about this particular slide is the idea of trying something new and trying something new that might be a little bit out of the box. So when it comes to trying new ideas, particularly risky new ideas, I'm careful. I am a textbook introvert, but I'm also very careful about decision making and not so much of a risk taker. I know these things about myself now. Maybe I didn't 5 years ago. I want to know all the facts. I want to take time to consider the situation, and I want to take a step back and really think through things. Stephanie has these amazing ideas, and she wants to act on them right now, like yesterday, maybe in 5 minutes. So we're definitely different in that way, and we've discovered over the years, and I credit Stephanie actually for asking me to take the Strengths Finder quiz, and that's one of the books I'm going to suggest to everybody. But she asked me to take this quiz, and it pointed out some ways in which our personalities conflict a little bit, and we have to be careful about how we interact with each other. My slow reaction to new ideas was frustrating to Stephanie because she felt like I was raining on her parade. She was enthusiastic about something and wanted to move forward on it, and I was always pulling in the reins and saying, hey, wait, I'm not there yet. So that really caused some friction because she felt like her enthusiasm was being sort of pushed down. When she took quick action on something that was risky, my anxiety just went through the roof, and I dug in my heels and got very nervous about things. So that really did cause some friction between the two of us. And now that we know that those are just personality traits that we have, and we're not necessarily going to be able to change our personalities, but we can change our behaviors. I now make an effort to react to that enthusiasm that she has for a new idea with enthusiasm. I want to recognize that it's an idea that I'm excited about. I'm just maybe not ready to act on it. And I also need to sometimes concede that my anxiety is probably pulling back a little bit too much, and I need to be willing to take a risk and to move forward. Stephanie also knows now that she gives me a little bit more time. She has told me that if she wants me to say yes to a decision, she doesn't force me to make a decision quickly. So she's also kind of realized that she needs to do some of that to help me to recognize that. So it's really all about setting, understanding those reactions, understanding strengths and weaknesses, and that Strengths Finder, again, I'm going to point out the book, and Stephanie's actually sharing it with you all in chat, has been incredibly helpful to me to really develop that leadership skill. The fourth of my 4 key characteristics is probably the one that makes people the most queasy. It also probably rings some bells for any of you who are, like me, fans of Brené Brown, and that is vulnerability. When I thought about how to talk about vulnerability, I thought really vulnerability is what we need in order for those other 3 traits to be possible. In order to be honest, in order to be humble, in order to be self-aware, we have to be willing to be vulnerable. And so there's nothing particularly new here except that we have to be open to failing. We have to be open to being honest about ourselves. At any time we're open to being honest, we are, of course, additionally vulnerable. Anytime we're trying to be self-aware, we're opening ourselves up to vulnerability. So those are my 4 characteristics. I think that I'm just looking here to see if there's any other thoughts in chat. Mary actually pointed out that great leaders recognize strengths and weaknesses of themselves and their team members, and that diversity is important on teams, and I couldn't agree more. If there's anything else that you want to share in chat about what you think of as characteristics of great leadership, please let me know. Stacy actually talked about communication, which again, I think is key. And honest communication. I think communication as a leader is obviously incredibly important. And Robert, we must stop looking at vulnerability as weakness. I love that. That's absolutely my mantra. So thank you for sharing that. I have become a big fan of that theory. I'm going to move on. I appreciate that so many of you are actually agreeing with that as well in the chat function. I'm going to move on and talk about just a couple of tools of authentic leadership, and this is also where I really do want, particularly those of you who are, you know, in your mid to late career, you've been leaders for a long time. What are the things that you've found that really work? And some of you have shared some of those already, but I'm going to talk about a couple of specifics. This particular document is the rules we live by. And this is something, I'm actually showing you a screenshot of the actual document that our PolicyIQ team has agreed on. This came from a training session that I did probably about 5 years ago now when I first became managing director of the team. I went to a training session for managing directors. It was a leadership session. And one of the things that they encouraged was to set a series of rules for your team. Now, when we talk about rules, we're not talking about, you know, we show up on time and we wash our dishes and put them in a dishwasher or whatever that type of thing is. Talking about really the values that your team lives by. By setting those values and by having the entire team agree that this is our value set, then you can obviously build on that and make that the foundation of the way that you lead the team. Now, most companies have something very similar to this that is a mission statement. RGP has a very, you know, structured and formal mission statement. We have company values that we live by as a corporation, and those are also really, really important. But this particular document is a little less formal, a little more casual, and it's also a little more specific. It's about the team that you're working in, and I think this is often really important for smaller teams particularly. Some of the things that I'll point out, some of the things that will actually look really familiar, even as you're looking at this kind of truncated list of them, are things like treating team members with respect, focusing on team success, asking for feedback, trusting your team members, being confident but not arrogant. Those are things that really fall into all of those leadership skills that we talked about. And the idea is that everybody on the team should be a leader in one way or another. The one rule that actually is cut off at the bottom of this list, but I also wanted to point out, is that one of the critical rules, and this is the last one on our list, is that life is too short to not enjoy what you're doing. I don't expect, and certainly we can't all enjoy every moment of our professional careers. There's lots of times where we have to do things that we don't necessarily enjoy. But life is too short to be in a position on the team and to really just dread coming into work every day. And so if that's the case, if you're in a position on our team where you just really don't want to be here, then we're doing something wrong, or there's something that's not a right fit there. And so one of the rules that we live by is that we really do want to make sure that everybody on average is happy with what they're doing. We can't make everybody happy every moment of the day, but on average everybody should be happy with what they're doing. So this particular document I think has served us well. This has been around for about 5 years now, and as I mentioned, everybody on the team at that time, we've actually just recently revisited it, but everybody on the team at that time sort of bought in to these rules that we live by. If anyone is interested, I will be providing my contact information towards the end of the session, and I'd be happy to send out a copy of this if it's something that you're interested in, if it's helpful to you. The second thing that I want to point out as a tool is something that's new to me. This actually came along, again, recently as I was getting that feedback, and Brandon, who is our company CEO, has an expectations document that he provides to all of the employees within his purview. And he suggested to me that maybe this is something I want to do. Because one of the things I was struggling with was I was getting frustrated with team members for things that they may not necessarily know that I had expectations around. And so his suggestion was, be deliberate. Make sure that you're deliberate about those expectations. And they were soft things. They weren't, you know, tasks. They weren't deadlines. They were soft things. And so I created this expectations document based on his example. So I do want to give him credit where credit is due. And it talked about not just what I expected of people on the team, but what they should be able to expect of me. And I think that might even be more important. And again, you'll notice that a lot of these things are things that we've already talked about: integrity, honesty, empowerment, respect, feedback. All of those things are things that we've talked about as being part of being an authentic and a great leader. The one thing that I will point out is that I added imperfection. It is important to me, and this is not meant to be a self-deprecating type of bullet point, but it's important to me that everybody on this team understands that I'm not perfect. And I do expect that I will make mistakes. I'm going to have bad days. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to make a bad decision. And I'm looking for feedback as much as anyone else. It's also important for me that they know that I take responsibility for any bad decisions. I take responsibility for my own behavior. My expectations of the team as well are very similar things. I expect people to be problem solvers. I expect people to be self-motivated, and there's a number of others there. Again, happy to send that out as an example. The one thing that I will tell you, and is probably hopefully obvious to you, is that this particular type of tool for authentic leadership is really only effective if you are in a position of formal leadership. If you are leading from within a team and you decide you want to set expectations for your team members, that's probably not going to go over all that well. So this particular tool is great for people that are in formal positions of leadership to help set those expectations. You might not have the opportunity to formally set expectations if you're leading from within. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about around tools really is about the books that have influenced me. And some of these I hope are going to be familiar to you. Authentic Leadership is one of those. It is a great baseline in talking about what authentic leadership is all about. The other ones are The Gifts of Imperfection. I've heard a couple of you talk about vulnerability, vulnerability and shame. I just love this book. I give it to everybody that I have a chance to give it to. But again, it's talking about the need for all of us to recognize that we are human, we are going to make mistakes, and to open ourselves up to be vulnerable and to be honest in our relationships. And then the last one that's on here is that Strengths Finder book. And Stephanie, I believe, had earlier also mentioned the full name of it. It is also a website. You can do the quiz online. It is, I believe, something that you do have to pay for. So if you do want to do the quiz online, you have to pay for it. If you purchase the book, you can do the quiz for free. So I suppose you're still paying for it. But it is a fantastic book, and the evaluation of your strengths and weaknesses, I think, is just amazing and spot on. It really has helped me a great deal in that self-awareness perspective. So Mario, I'm going to actually turn it over to you. We're going to open up the Q&A, and I'm going to let you, take a moment and bring up some of the questions, and then we'll kind of close with my contact information.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. That was an excellent presentation. And I do just want to mention, Chris, so at CBA, they actually are starting a little bit of an initiative around the Strength Finders book. All incoming freshmen will be required to actually take the quiz and find out their top 5 strengths, and then any current students who haven't taken it will also be taking it through a couple of the common classes here.
That's fantastic, and I actually remember seeing that in a presentation a few weeks ago, and I love that idea. I think it's fantastic. It really is one of the best tools that I've discovered.
All right, so at this time, we'll address questions. So if you have a question about any of the material that was presented, simply submit it through the Q&A tab. If your presentation's full screen at this time and you wish to submit a question, you'll need to exit the full screen view and return to the WebEx event window before you see the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. So moving forward here, we just wanted to touch on a couple of upcoming events. On the next slide, Chris, you'll see our next webinar, which is Stepping into the World of Silicon Valley. This will be presented by Rose Choi, a recent graduate from the class of 2014. She's currently a marketing solutions specialist at LinkedIn, and that webinar will be on November 11th at noon, and you can register at cba.pitt.edu/20. A couple of other upcoming events. Today, Associate Dean Audra Morell is on her roadshow in Boston. November 11th will be our next webinar, Stepping into the World of Silicon Valley. And then on the 12th, we'll have the Associate Dean Roadshow in Greensburg, PA, as well as attending the Pitt Business Admissions webinar. On November 18th, you can look for a webinar titled Breadth versus Depth, What's the Right Balance for Me and My Career? Lastly, we invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and you can see all of those profiles there on the screen. So at this time, we'll move into the Q&A session. We can see a couple questions coming up here. So we have a question by Anita, Chris. She would like to know, how do you handle a manager who focuses on weaknesses rather than strengths?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult one. I've been in that situation, so I've certainly had, you know, I've talked about the great managers and leaders that I've had in the past. There are always a few that don't fall into that category. I think the most important thing that you can do for yourself, number one, is to try to be self-aware about what your strengths are and to look for opportunities to utilize those strengths, to actually look for opportunities to put those forward. I would also say, and I'm going to ask folks maybe in chat as well to give some ideas, because I'm sure other folks have some ideas about how to answer this question. The other thing I would say, Anita, is to look for professional mentors that may not necessarily be your manager. And that can be difficult. I don't know the situation. It can certainly be difficult. But to look for somebody within the organization, maybe even without or within a community organization, who can be that mentor for you, that can help you to develop your strengths, maybe look at what some of those weaknesses are that your manager keeps pointing out, and find ways to help you to really develop into the type of leader that you want to be. It is an incredibly difficult situation. You will always encounter those managers who do focus on the negative rather than on the positive. And the best that we can do really is to, number one, be self-aware enough in our own minds to say, I do have those strengths. I know that I can focus on those, and there are some things that I can do to help build those and develop those. And then also to look for ways to surround ourselves with people that will build us up and make sure that we're focusing on those strengths. And again, I would say, Stephanie actually even proposes that you address that, you know, propose that with your manager, if that's something that you can do, to say, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like you to tell me what my strengths are. You know, sometimes that's difficult for somebody, but I think there are ways to do that.
All right, Chris, we have another question for you here. So you mentioned that all leaders question their leadership skills at some time, and also stress the importance of self-awareness multiple times through the presentation. So Megan would like to know, what are some questions you ask yourself to make sure that you're being the best leader you possibly can be?
You guys are not asking easy questions, I will tell you that, but they are great questions. I think one of the things that I find myself, that I ask myself frequently is, how honest am I being with the people around me about, you know, where we stand? And I think that's because that's one of those areas that I struggle with the most, you know, is making sure that I'm being honest about the good and the bad. I also, while I think self-awareness is important, a lot of times in order to really know if you're being the best leader you can be, it's not about asking yourself those questions, but it is about asking other people those questions. You do need to seek the feedback from others. I think the self-awareness from my perspective is often that I feel and I kind of know that something's going wrong, but I don't necessarily know exactly what it is, and that's when I need to seek the feedback and get more information. So it's a great question. It's actually something now that I'm thinking, boy, I need to think about that and actually put that into the presentation. You know, if I ever present this again, that's something that I want to ask or I want to stress. But again, I think it's mostly that the self-awareness is recognizing that maybe something's not going right, and the questions I ask are actually of others to find out exactly what that is, what is not going right, and how can I correct it. It's a great question. And again, I'll say if anyone else has any other thoughts, please feel free to add those in chat or ask other questions that are out there.
So, Chris, another question for you. For the students who are on today, what advice would you give them in their leadership? And I know a common concern among students is with more and more companies kind of taking chances with recent graduates, putting them into management positions where they may be overseeing people who have been with the company for a longer time. How can we handle that situation with a little bit of a generational gap maybe?
Oh, wow. That is a fantastic question, and actually one that I do feel really kind of close to my own heart. Ask for help. The first leadership position that I really found myself in, I have to admit that I struggled. I was in a similar position, coming out of college, being put into a leadership position or management position more quickly than at the time I thought I should have been. And the difference there is that, to me, I felt like I had to project a persona that was, I know what I'm doing. You do have to project a persona of confidence, but you don't have to always know the answer. And for me, I really struggled because I didn't want anyone to know that I didn't know the answer to something. And so I was constantly in this battle with myself, and I really did need to get comfortable with the fact that I needed to ask for help. I guess that's really the bottom line. You do need to make sure that you're asking for help when you need it. You need to admit that there are things that you've not experienced before. Again, I would look for professional mentors and people around you who have been there and who have done it. So I think that's really about, you know, learning how to project confidence and still being asked and asking for help. And then, Mario, the other thing that you had asked about was with the generational gap, and that's also a challenge, I think, for a lot of situations. Generational gap as well as experience gap. Even if you come into a team where people have been around for a lot longer than you have been in that team, the key to that situation, the key to that is really to acknowledge that they know the situation and not to rush to judgment that you think you know better. There are certainly going to be plenty of times and plenty of opportunity for you to make changes and make adjustments based on your experiences, but really to acknowledge that the people that have been there for a long time do have something to offer, and to make sure that you are giving them an opportunity to promote that and to continue to be leaders and teachers of you as a leader.
Great, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got another question here. A lot of great leaders have a role model, somebody that they, you know, kind of model their own leadership style off of, and who would you say might be a role model for you?
That is another fantastic question, and I will, I'm going to give you a long-winded answer. Maybe not long-winded, but I'm going to give you a couple of different answers. Ralph, who I mentioned, really was a pivotal leader for me because it was one of the toughest professional experiences. And so to have a leader who's able to lead you through really one of the most difficult professional experiences that you go through and come out of it feeling like, man, I really learned something. Like, I am a better person for having gone through that. It's hard to not look to somebody like that as really one of your professional mentors and a role model. I will also point to, and again, I know I'm being, you know, pointing to some folks on my own team, but I have some fantastic people on my own team. Stephanie Beerley, she and I have worked together for, again, like I said, just over 10 years now. It's hard not to also look to her as a role model for leadership, and she's influenced me in self-awareness and vulnerability and, you know, some of those things. So I would also say even my peers and the folks that I've worked with and continue to work with are role models for me on the, you know, on the team. And then you also have your, you know, your personal role models. I have a role model in my grandmother who is, you know, one of the most sort of forgiving and easygoing and laid-back people that I've ever met. And so, you know, on a personal note, I think she also teaches me some leadership skills about just not letting things get to me. So I think there's a little bit of that as well.
Great, thank you. So it looks like it's about time to start wrapping up here. So any final thoughts before we conclude the webinar, Chris?
I don't think so. I think I will just put up my contact information. There were a couple of people who asked about getting the rules we live by and the expectations document. If you gentlemen can maybe save the chat for me so I know who those folks are, or I would ask, you know, maybe what they'll do is just send me an email message. My email and my phone number are here. I am really happy to chat with anybody, to connect with you on LinkedIn. Just let me know why we're connecting so that I know who you are. And if there are any questions or anything that I can do to help, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you. Thank you, Mario. Thank you to the team at Pitt Business for putting this together. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate all of the feedback and the participation.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. We really appreciate you taking the time, and it was a really excellent presentation. I think I can speak for everyone when we say we learned a lot today. So thank you again. And ladies and gentlemen, that will conclude today's webinar. So on behalf of the University of Pittsburgh and the College of Business Administration, I'd like to thank you for your attendance today.
Thanks, everyone.